Deep within the oral traditions of the Mapuche people of southern South America, there existed a creature so feared that its very name was enough to make a traveler hesitate before stepping outside after dark. It was not a demon born of European imagination, nor a beast borrowed from distant mythologies. It was something uniquely its own, ancient, shape-shifting, and hungry. This is the story of the Peuchen. Before we begin, if you find value in these deep dives into mythology and folklore from around the world, consider subscribing and following the channel. It genuinely helps keep these stories alive, and there are many more episodes on the way. Now, let us go back. To understand the Peuchen, one must first understand the people who told its story. The Mapuche were, and remain today, one of the most significant indigenous groups of the Americas, inhabiting the regions of south-central Chile and southwestern Argentina. Their name, derived from their own language Mapudungun, translated roughly as people of the land, Mapu meaning land, and Che meaning people. They were a resilient, deeply spiritual people whose cosmology was elaborate, layered, and inseparable from the natural world around them. The Mapuche worldview was not simply a collection of entertaining stories. It was a cosmological framework, a way of explaining the forces of nature, the dangers of the wilderness, the causes of illness, and the ongoing war between good and evil forces that shaped every aspect of life. Central to this framework was the belief in a world populated by powerful spiritual entities, both benevolent and malevolent. Among the most feared of all malevolent beings in the Mapuche world was the Peuchen, also recorded in historical and ethnographic texts under the variant spellings Peuchen, Peuchen, and Peuchen, depending on regional dialect and the transcription choices of the scholars who documented it. The creature's name itself carried weight. In Mapudungun, linguistic analysis of the root words associated with Peuchen has been connected to concepts of flying, stinging, and in some interpretations, poisoning. The Peuchen was not a deity in the traditional sense. It belonged to a category of beings the Mapuche called Wakufu, malevolent supernatural forces or spirits that caused harm, illness, and misfortune to human beings. It was, in the architecture of Mapuche belief, one of the most powerful Wakufu in existence. The physical description of the Peuchen was not fixed to a single image across all accounts, a reflection of both its shape-shifting nature and the oral tradition through which its legend was preserved. However, consistent core features emerged across documented accounts. In its primary natural form, the Peuchen was described as a large, flying serpent. Some accounts emphasized enormous size, a snake of considerable length with the power of flight. Others described it as a creature resembling a winged serpent or a coiling, airborne dragon-like beast, though the Mapuche conception was distinct from the European dragon tradition. The creature was frequently described as capable of moving silently through the air, which made it particularly terrifying. Unlike beasts that announce their presence with sound, the Peuchen could descend upon a victim without warning. Its coloring was not uniformly described, but several accounts referenced dark or iridescent qualities, a creature that could blend into the night sky or the surface of dark water. In some recorded versions, the Peuchen was described as possessing multiple heads, or as a serpent with features that blurred the line between snake and other animals. Some documented accounts describe the Peuchen as sometimes appearing in the sky as a luminous or fiery presence, particularly over lakes and rivers at night. Witnesses who claimed to have seen it described a streak of light moving over water before livestock were found dead and drained of blood by morning. Of all the things that were documented about the Peuchen, the manner in which it killed was perhaps the most disturbing, because it was silent, invisible, and left almost no trace. The first sign that the Peuchen had arrived was sound. The creature was documented across multiple accounts as emitting a strange, piercing, whistling sound as it moved through the air, described in Spanish-language sources using the noun silbidos, meaning whistles or whistling. This sound was said to carry through the night air, and in some traditions was described as the Peuchen whistling 3 times before it approached its prey. In some accounts, the whistling and hissing were not merely incidental sounds, but were themselves weapons. The sound alone, in certain versions of the legend, was enough to stun a victim, dropping their defenses before the creature even made visual contact. The 3-whistle sequence, documented in Chilote oral tradition, was understood as a kind of announcement, the Peuchen signaling its presence. But it was not a warning given out of mercy. It was the beginning of the hunt. Once the Peuchen was close enough to make visual contact with the victim, the killing sequence entered its most defining phase. Its gaze could paralyze an intended victim and permit it to suck their blood. In the Mapuche understanding, this was not a purely physical effect. It was the suppression of the victim's spiritual agency, a kind of domination over both the body and the spirit simultaneously. Some accounts held that the creature's hiss and gaze were capable of killing prey outright, while in other versions the gaze paralyzed the victim, and the creature then leisurely fed on the blood of the stupefied victim. The snake coils around the victim, pierces the neck with its fangs, and drains them of blood. When livestock were found dead and attributed to the Peuchen, a common occurrence in herding communities across the Mapuche and Chilote territories, herders blamed the monster for their sheep and goats found slaughtered overnight. The animals showed no conventional predator wounds. No wolf, no puma, no human weapon had been at work. The bodies were simply found, still and drained. The most extraordinary and most unsettling detail in the Peuchen's killing tradition was that it took the hearts of its victims without leaving a mark on the body. This detail appeared consistently across Mapuche and Chilote accounts, and was one of the most distinctive features of the Peuchen's killing method. A victim who had been killed by the Peuchen showed no external wound, no bruise, no puncture, no sign of physical violence. The body looked, to an uninformed eye, as though the person had simply died in their sleep. But the heart was gone. How the Peuchen accomplished this was not explained in mechanistic terms in the tradition. The Mapuche and Chilote understanding was that it could reach into a person and extract what animated them without touching the surface of the body at all. This was, in the cosmological understanding of those who told these stories, the most terrifying of the Peuchen's capabilities. Physical wounds could be understood, treated, mourned, but a body found intact with no explanation, with nothing to point to, that was a different kind of loss. It was a killing that left no evidence, and therefore no closure. In accounts involving human victims who survived partial encounters, those who were found paralyzed rather than dead, the aftermath was described in consistent terms. Survivors were discovered in states of profound weakness and shock, pale, unable to speak, sometimes unable to move for extended periods even after the creature had gone. In hot weather, the creature was said to remain clinging to the bark of a tree so that dribbling blood could be found underneath. A detail from Mapuche tradition that suggested the creature did not always consume everything in the moment of attack, that its presence in a location could be detected by the evidence it left on the landscape even when the victim itself was not found. In the Mapuche medical and spiritual tradition, someone who presented with an unexplained wasting illness, chronic weakness, pallor, loss of appetite, and inability to recover, was sometimes understood to be suffering from the ongoing or repeated attentions of the Peuchen. The creature did not always kill in a single encounter. It could return, and each return left the victim more diminished than before. The Peuchen was not feared simply because of its appearance. It was feared because of what it could do. The most defining and most documented power of the Peuchen was its ability to transform itself into virtually any animal. This was not a minor trick. It was a fundamental aspect of the creature's predatory nature. The Peuchen used shape-shifting as a hunting strategy, allowing it to approach humans and animals in a form that did not immediately register as threatening. In documented accounts, it was said to have taken the form of birds, small mammals, and other creatures familiar to those living in the Mapuche territories. The transformation was reportedly seamless and convincing. Only those trained in recognizing the Peuchen's presence, or those spiritually equipped to see beyond surface appearances, could identify it in a disguised form. This shape-shifting ability meant that the Peuchen existed as a kind of paranoia-inducing presence in the landscape. Any unfamiliar animal encountered at night, any bird behaving strangely near a camp, any creature that appeared where it should not have been, these could all, in the framework of Mapuche belief, be the Peuchen in disguise. The second major power of the Peuchen was its ability to paralyze its victims. Some accounts recorded by later researchers suggested that the paralysis could persist even after the Peuchen had departed, that victims found in the morning near the bodies of dead animals were sometimes discovered in a state of shock, unable to speak or move coherently, which was interpreted as the lingering effect of the creature's power. The Peuchen was, at its core, a blood-drinking creature, what scholars of comparative mythology would classify as a vampiric entity, though it preceded the European vampiric tradition and arose entirely independently of it. The Peuchen's ability to fly was not simply a mode of transportation. It was part of what made it so difficult to escape and so difficult to combat. It could attack from above, it could disappear into the sky, and it could cover vast distances. This flight was described as silent, which amplified its predatory advantage. Some accounts described the Peuchen as particularly active over lakes and rivers, and it was specifically associated with bodies of water in the Mapuche landscape. The connection between the Peuchen and water deserves its own discussion, because it appeared consistently across different recorded accounts, and was not incidental. The Mapuche landscape of south-central Chile is defined in significant part by its lake district, a region of extraordinary natural beauty characterized by volcanic peaks, dense forest, and numerous deep, cold lakes. These lakes held deep significance in Mapuche cosmology. They were not simply bodies of water. They were understood as thresholds, places where the boundaries between the ordinary world and the supernatural world were thin. The Peuchen was said to inhabit these lakes, or to use them as hunting grounds. The bodies of drowned individuals were sometimes interpreted not as accidental deaths, but as Peuchen attacks. A person who ventured too close to the water at night, or who crossed a lake in darkness, was considered vulnerable. In some regional accounts, specific lakes in the Chilean and Argentine south were associated with Peuchen sightings. The indigenous memory of particular bodies of water as dangerous or spiritually charged was, in many cases, connected to the presence of this creature. This aquatic association also connected the Peuchen to the broader category of water-dwelling supernatural entities in Mapuche belief. The tradition was not unique to the Peuchen. Other supernatural beings also inhabited or emerged from water. But the Peuchen's connection to lakes was one of the more consistently documented geographic associations in its mythology. The question of the Peuchen's origin, how it came to exist, was addressed in some accounts, though not with the consistent narrative structure of, say, a creation myth. In several traditions, the Peuchen was associated with Calcu, the Mapuche term for a sorcerer or witch who wielded evil power. The Calcu occupied the opposite end of the spiritual spectrum from the Machi, who was the community's healer and spiritual leader. Where the Machi used spiritual power to protect and heal, the Calcu used it to harm. In some accounts, the Peuchen was described not as an independent entity that simply existed in the wild, but as something that could be summoned, controlled, or even created by a Calcu. The evil sorcerer, in this tradition, wielded the Peuchen as a weapon, directing it against enemies, using it to cause illness, or unleashing it on livestock to weaken a rival family. This relationship between the Peuchen and the Calcu added a layer of human malice to the creature's mythology. Whether the Peuchen had a specific moment of birth in a mythological sense was not as clearly documented as its nature and actions. It appeared in most accounts to be an ancient and persistent evil, something that had existed in the land for as long as the Mapuche could remember. It was not described as the offspring of specific supernatural parents in the way that some mythological creatures in other traditions are. It was simply, and terrifyingly, there. If the Kalku was associated with the Peuchen's deployment as a weapon, then the Machi was the figure around whom the tradition of combating the Peuchen was built. The Machi was believed to be one of the only human beings capable of defeating the Peuchen. This capacity was rooted in their spiritual knowledge, their ability to perceive the supernatural world, and the protective power that came with their initiation and practice. In accounts of Machi combat with the Peuchen, the shaman was said to use ritual tools, spiritual knowledge, specific plants, and ceremonial chants to weaken and defeat the creature. The kultran, the Machi's sacred drum, played a role in these encounters, as it did in virtually all Machi spiritual work. The Peuchen, despite its formidable array of powers, was described as vulnerable to the Machi's intervention. The creature could not simply overpower a Machi who was fully prepared and spiritually fortified. Certain plants held protective or offensive power against the Peuchen in documented tradition. The foye tree, Drimis winteri, known in Spanish as canelo, was among the most sacred plants in Mapuche cosmology and was associated with protection against evil forces. Its presence in ritual contexts involving the Peuchen and other malevolent beings was documented in ethnographic accounts. Because the Peuchen's most dangerous capacity was its shape-shifting disguise, recognizing it was itself a form of defense. The Machi's ability to see through transformations was critical. In some accounts, the creature was said to lose some of its power once it had been identified and named, a pattern familiar in supernatural traditions worldwide, where naming a thing strips it of some agency. The Peuchen was, in the fullest sense of what mythology can be, a story told not for entertainment alone, but as a map of a dangerous world and a manual for surviving it. Born from the spiritual tradition of the Mapuche people of southern South America, it took the form of a great flying serpent that drank blood, paralyzed its victims, and moved through the night sky over the lakes and forests of a landscape its people knew deeply and respected completely. It could change its shape, it could be wielded by the wicked, and it could only be stopped by those with the spiritual courage and preparation to face it. The Machi stood against it. The community protected itself through ritual and ceremony. The stories were passed down, kept sharp and specific, ensuring that what was known about the Peuchen was never forgotten, because forgetting it, in the Mapuche understanding, would have been its own kind of danger. The Peuchen endured in the oral tradition not because it was a good story, but because it was a true one. True in the way that myths are true, as a distilled account of real fears, real experiences, and real wisdom about the world and its hidden dangers. Thank you for spending this time with the story of the Peuchen. If this episode gave you something to think about, please consider sharing it with someone who would appreciate it. There are more episodes ahead. The Mapuche tradition alone holds many more figures worthy of this kind of careful attention, and we will be returning to them. Join us again for the next one.